we are essentially designing a grand scheme for ever-expanding homelessness. So there are a number of ways to address this issue, but in the final analysis, the question is, what will the market bear? What incentives will government provide to cause more affordable to be built? We have an obligation to facilitate that. Just a little ingenuity resolves a whole lot.
Mark Ridley Thomas currently serves as the Councilmember of Los Angeles' 10th District, elected in 2020. He began his career in public service in 1991, serving 3 terms as Councilmember of the 8th District until 2002, where he pioneered initiatives in resident engagement and neighborhood empowerment. He then went on to serve as state assembly member, state senator, and most recently as Los Angeles County Supervisor of the 2nd District from 2008 to 2020. A lifelong resident of Los Angeles, Mark Ridley Thomas, also known as MRT, is widely regarded as one of the region's most creative, effective, and progressive voices for change in Los Angeles. Over the course of his career, he has been at the forefront of addressing the region's most pressing issues, including major funding initiatives for affordable housing and co-chairing the statewide task force on homelessness for Governor Gavin Newsom. Earlier this year, MRT introduced a motion that was unanimously approved by City Council to have the city explore establishing a right to housing, part of his 11-part policy brief to end homelessness and build more equitable development. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for your time.
I've been fully prepped.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
This right to housing policy brief that you put out and also the motion, there was a point in there, point 9, that I wanted to look at around building up our safety net. There's this issue around, the unsheltered population, but that's just the tip of the iceberg of those impacted by the housing crisis. How do you build up more housing for teachers, janitors, our essential workers in our community? And you sort of touched on this point of, looking at the statistic over the past decade of what's been built in Los Angeles, 91% of new housing production is for above moderate income households. Is the call to action for development to occur in a, more equitable fashion?
What will the market bear?
Yeah.
To the extent that development is profit driven, the point of it is to maximize profits to the extent that that can be achieved. And the profit margin is more readily available in market rate housing than in affordable housing generically.
When you look at the income distribution of how our housing is being built, you have 8% on the 60% AMI and below, and then 91% on sort of the 140 or 120% AMI and above, which leaves 0.5% for the entire moderate income levels. How do you solve that problem? Is the market's not building it, and public subsidy is already limited and should be focused on our most vulnerable population. So how do you address this deficit gap in the middle where the market and the public sector do not really focus?
Well, I think just a little ingenuity resolves a whole lot. I subscribe to the following: where there's a will, there's a way. I just simply am guided by that, my public policy of making work. That brings about the discussion about inclusionary zoning and the range of other things that can and should happen. It brings about the question of redevelopment law that carries with it requirements about the amount of affordable that has to be built. And so there are a number of ways to address this issue. But in the final analysis, the question is, what will the market bear? First of all. Secondly, what incentives will government provide to cause more affordable to be built on the strength of our assumption that that's what can be afforded. Therefore, we have an obligation to facilitate that. Otherwise, we are essentially designing a grand scheme for ever expanding homelessness. In other words, the lack of putting incentives in play, tax credits, writing down the length, et cetera, et cetera. The lack of doing those things make for blighted communities, communities where properties can't be afforded. Homelessness deepens, broadens, it expands because of the lack of public policy that's driving and informing what can and should happen in real life.
The right to housing, more than anything, seems to be sort of a moral obligation. It's sort of clearing the pathway for getting the funding lined up, getting the different parties together to build the housing you need. The first thing you need is for everyone to be on the same page with a moral obligation to value housing at a certain level, right? Is that sort of the mission behind the right to housing, is sort of a call to your value of how people see housing?
I think that's fair up to a point, Charlie. You might argue that it's an attempt to construct a policy framework that has at least two dimensions. One is philosophical, the other is very practical or pragmatic. Right. There are four pillars on which this right to housing rests. And if we were to be guided by it, we can build more consensus on how to confront it. You would have more conversation about housing production in its various expressions, how we should honor the dignity and worth of every person. I know that a significant problem that stares us in the face in the form of homelessness and its stubbornness is in no small measure attributable to the lack of a right to housing as it expresses itself. You have a right to vote, you have a right to education, a right to clean air, you have disability rights, but with respect to a right to housing, no matter how deeply ensconced it is in the rhetoric around democratic sensibilities, going back to FDR, going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a range of other foundational documents. It is my view that government has an obligation, and it ought to be an enforceable obligation. To the extent that that is the case, we will then see those who were formerly homeless accessing that which is theirs by virtue of the fact that they have a right to housing, to a roof, to a door, to a bed, not to a sidewalk or a park bench. And so I think a right to housing goes a very long way in addressing this issue. In other words, we have to scale up our approach to addressing this homeless crisis.
That's great. I mean, it kind of goes to the ingenuity that you mentioned earlier is,
exactly.
If you are united on a right to housing, people are behind this code.
Right.
You are able to also bring in the markets, the private sector, and trying to hack at this problem too, because there's sort of a whole market value that we're not really seeing in this essential workforce.
It's important that people know what they're talking about. There's a whole lot of education that needs to go on, and I trust that the Housing Innovation Collaborative is doing its part to cause people across the board, both policymakers as well as stakeholders, generally speaking, to have a higher IQ as to what we're up against and how we should go about it.
Yeah, that's great.
That's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
I love it. Councilman Mark Ridley Thomas, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for, once again, your wisdom and your leadership. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take good care. Appreciate it.
All right.